Sanibonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to the Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. It's episode 225 of the Private Property Podcast. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to it. Every single weekday at 7 p.m., you can join us right here across Private Property's social media pages where we tackle a hot property topic. Now, you've certainly seen that you've missed out on a lot of great episodes that we've already had on the show. So do make sure that you go to our Facebook or YouTube page to catch up on all the great content. To all our regular viewers, welcome back. You know how we do it every single weekday. We have an appointment where we better learn how to navigate our property journey and learn from experts on how we can make better decisions when it comes to our property portfolios. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're looking to buy, to sell, to build, are you looking to rent, or perhaps grow your property portfolio. This certainly is the podcast that caters to all of your property needs. Now, one of the other things, of course, is besides this daily property talk show, we also have other whole host of property shows across the Private Property's social media platforms. As it is a Monday, you can catch Chad at 8 p.m. on the Home Shoppers Show, and he comes to your screens every single Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. So if you're ever on the market for a new property, doesn't matter whether it's in an estate or perhaps a nice little starter pack house, that is certainly the show that you want to tune into. Umbali Nwoko takes care of all your agricultural needs of Tuesdays and Thursdays. She brings you all you have to all you want to do, of course, on when it comes to agriculture. And I see my colleague, as you see me stumbling, has just texted me saying today's Tuesday. Of course, this is what happens when we have a long weekend. We mix up our Mondays and our Tuesdays. So thank you very much there to Biola for texting me and letting me know it's a Tuesday. I know it's a fake Monday for many of us, but it's a Tuesday as we are, of course, still talking property. Now, on Wednesday, Esty Clausen brings you the First Time Home Buyers Show, where she is in conversation with other homeowners who've already walked that first-time home buying journey to get a sense of some of the things that they've done that worked and didn't work, and you're able to learn from some of their mistakes. So we certainly do have quite a whole host of shows for you here across the social media platforms of Private Property. So do make sure that you are, of course, subscribed and you continue following us and engaging us on our social media platforms. And you can follow myself on Twitter as well as on Instagram at Zamantungwa_K as we continue to tackle all things relating to property. Now, one of the other things that you're definitely going to pick up on when you are engaging with us on our social media platforms is that we are currently running our Sherlock Holmes competition. Now, we're currently in the 10th week of this competition, so there are 2 more weeks to go. And all you have to do in order for you to stand a chance to walk away with a 5,000 Rand voucher every single Friday is to go onto our website, www.privateproperty.co.za, and crack this week's riddle. Now, it is, we've shared the riddle. We shared it yesterday because it was a Monday. And the riddle for week 10 of the Sherlock Holmes hunt is let your imagination go wild with pricing at the bay where you'd love to camp. 6 gorgeous rooms, 6 gorgeous rooms to fit all your friends, and a flat even this Watson would take. I don't know where this one leads us. I usually try to give people a few clues. I know sometimes it's very overtly Gauteng or KZN or the Western Cape. This time around, not so much. But if you think you can crack this one, then do go to our website to enter the competition, and you stand a chance of walking away with that 5,000 Rand voucher at the end of the week. And to make sure that we make the winner's circle as big as possible, every Wednesday and Thursday, we also give away a 500 Rand spot prize. And all you have to do to walk away with that cash prize is to be watching us live so you can claim it should we call your name at the end of the show. Now, of course, we are, getting started with our show this evening, and it's a topic that's, primarily for the landlords. And, oftentimes we talk obviously to buyers, to sellers, and different people in their property journey. This evening, we're looking at how landlords can best best prepare for the 2021 property year. And one of the things I was even saying to my guest off air is we're nearing the tail end of Q1 of 2021. And if anything, this is probably that time as a landlord where you should also be doing a bit of stock taking yourself. Maybe you're even comparing where you were at this time last year. So some of what we're going to be looking at, this evening is getting back to basics. When we talk about being a landlord, investing in property, what exactly do we mean? When it comes to getting back to basics, looking at some of the landlords who've actually thrived during COVID. We know that we've faced very difficult times. What did they do right in order for them to almost cushion themselves from the effects of COVID? Then also looking at those who are not doing so well and how they could potentially get themselves to being in a better position and make sure that their portfolios are in a slightly better position. And of course, to the new investors or those who are, of course, aspiring to enter the property space, we'll also just give you a few tips on what to be looking out for if you want to be entering property investment in 2021. Now, my guest this evening needs no introduction. We've had him on the show previously. There's, of course, David Beattie, who is an entrepreneur, is also the author of The Expert Landlord. David, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Fantastic to see you again, Zama, and hi to all the guests.
David, I think one of the great things that I was saying to you off air is that we've just started 2021. I mean, if I reflect this time last year, I was even laughing with you off air. This was the day where so many of us, in 2020, were debating when midnight is, because this is when our lockdown was going to start. And many people were like, "Is it starting tomorrow, today? Like, if I'm still on the road just after midnight, what would happen?" And we're now literally nearly 365 days into lockdown, and obviously quite a lot has happened within the property space, just like in every other industry. And they've been, a lot of property owners have found themselves affected by the, by COVID-19 and the economic effects. Firstly, perhaps let's look at, if we almost compare where the market was this time last year and now, I mean, what would the comparison be like, especially from a landlord's perspective? I mean, you're a landlord yourself, you also, work with other landlords. When you kind of look at where the property space in that regard was, where would you say we currently are now in terms of how we fare with where we were a year ago?
Look, it's not that when COVID happened that we're coming off a great market. We're coming off quite a tough market as it was. And then when COVID hit, it just put everything on steroids and made everything go so much worse, so much quicker. But I think those landlords that are kind of done, look, the market is still tough now. I mean, there's no doubt that we're not into pre-COVID levels at any means. But I think from an income perspective, we can say. But from a business basics perspective, if one has rejigged and made some tough decisions and had the discipline, I think landlords and those in the service industry within property should be surviving relatively okay now. But it's not without a whole lot of blood, sweat and tears to get to a stage where one is a little bit more in cruising mode. But the market is still tough. But there are strategies and things that one can do to survive in this market. I don't think we're in market conditions where one can say we were all going to thrive. Sure, there are some pockets where there is some price increases and so forth. But as a whole, I think having a conservative view is probably the wisest way to do it at the moment. And I do want to say that those that are doing the basics well and running their property business well, whether it's a landlord or any other kind of property business, one can survive. I think the days of expecting to take over the world and do some amazing over-the-top turnover, I think would be unrealistic and probably fairly dangerous at the moment.
And David, I actually want us to explore what you then mean by getting back to basics. I said it in the intro, and you've also just mentioned it just now. When we talk about particularly landlords getting back to basics in order for them to be able to survive during these COVID times, what exactly does that mean?
Okay, so it just means doing the right things more proactively. So being a landlord is really being like a business owner, a little business owner, really. And some landlords, have big portfolios, and some landlords are just having one unit. Either way, the basics of I'm in a service business, my tenant is a client, my property is a product, and the better quality my product is, the better quality customer I'm going to get, and the better chance I have of holding that customer. So what it means, understanding demand and supply. And at the moment, the demand is in certain segments, or most segments, are fairly low compared to the supply of properties. It means that affects pricing. Is my pricing competitive? Is my property adding all the different bells and whistles that it should to be a competitive product? Maybe I'm saying this is a tough market, so my margins might not be as high as I normally would be, but I'm more interested in turnover, and a basic turnover on a monthly turnover, than trying to hit it out the park and having excessive turnover, because that's just not realistic in this market. So it really, am I, and I think lastly on this point is, am I being proactive as a landlord? 5 years ago, one could be fairly kind of reactive and just put something on Gumtree or private property, and you'd have, 20 inquiries, or and you could just let out a unit. Now you've got to be much more engaged. You've got to work with your tenants a lot more. You've got to be reactive to them. You've got to give them better service, because they can just look for a better deal elsewhere. So those are the kind of things that, and as a landlord, those that are engaged, as opposed to blaming circumstances or blaming others, but are taking the responsibility themselves to learn and to implement actions. It's not that complicated, actually. Those landlords, one can't be overly innovative in this market. There's not a lot of things that we can be innovative about. It's just a question of doing the basics well. Like, do I make sure that I contact my tenant? Do I make sure that I do the inspection properly? Do I make sure that I'm doing my statements, my monthly statements, that I'm checking my bank statement of the first of the month, that I'm collecting well, and as opposed to expecting my tenant to perform. If my tenant is going through a tough time, like many tenants have been, am I negotiating proactively with the tenant, as opposed to just reacting or just waiting, for things to happen? So I don't know if that answers it, Zama.
No, it definitely does, David. It actually makes me think of how more than anything, this is also the time where, as landlords, you're almost slowly starting to also have a more active relationship with your tenant, as opposed to, as you were saying, where you would kind of maybe just send out that one mailer that has the statement and they pay you and that's it, and it's kind of automated. Whereas now you almost want a slightly more personal touch to your interaction with your tenant, because anything essentially can happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
You also want to make sure that you give your good tenants really good treatment, so that they don't leave. I mean, sometimes obviously people do leave, perhaps their family's growing or they're changing jobs, but more often than not, people tend to not want to leave a place that unless they absolutely have to. So you also want to make sure that you are putting in strategies to retain your good tenant, and that extra almost personal touch certainly does go a long way. I mean, I remember when I think it was 2 weeks ago, when we were seeing protests in the Braamfontein area. Some of my properties are there, and I literally sort of messaged my tenants to say, listen, I'm seeing these reports on social media, and they're happening fairly close to, the building, stay safe. And I know that they were quite surprised, because they were like, oh, wow, thank you, for the message. I also saw, obviously, they could also see the activity outside, but it's definitely not something you would expect your landlord to kind of, message you about, because it's readily on social media. You're probably also seeing it as you step out, but it is that sort of almost extra personal touch that does go a long way, and also shows your tenant that, listen, in as much as this is, we'll say, a business transaction, there's a human being on both sides, and we're kind of meeting each other also at that sort of human level. Yes, David, you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Personal touch is super important, and to acknowledge your tenant as a fellow human being, and respecting their space. At the same time, one of the side benefits is that if you as a landlord are being professional, it means that you can have a better chance of expecting, or not only receiving better performance from your tenant, but also you can push back much more strongly where there's a lack of performance from a tenant. So the tenant can't say, oh, no, you didn't do my maintenance, or you haven't been in touch with me, or I can't ever get hold of you, because tenants use that as an excuse. You can immediately get down to business and say, look, I've given you a professional service, let's sit down and discuss, or let's have a Zoom call and discuss how we're going to move through this challenging time where you've lost your job or whatever. And you've got much more leverage to negotiate with your tenant. We had this one tenant. One of the things in this challenge at the moment is to recognize and understand your risks and you manage your risks accordingly. So, for example, the one big risk at this time is, am I going to get my rent paid on time and in full? So, for example, we had this proactive landlord who was pretty much in this time when we were discussing about midnight and all that, he was already on our case for let's say we managed about 40 or 50 of his units. And he was already on our case saying, okay, how's your billing doing? What is your strategy on the second of the month? How are we going to, so we immediately were starting to talk about what's going to happen and what are you, because the risk was, am I going to get my rent? Another risk that we need to look at, and you alluded to it, is my property going to be empty? And after saying to my team, actually this morning, in our management meeting this morning, was our occupancy levels in certain buildings in Johannesburg have gone up to 100% occupancy, so 0 vacancies. And one of the reasons why we're getting better occupancy levels is because we're looking after the maintenance of those properties better. So tenants are not, they don't feel, as you said, they don't want to move. But if the property is maintained, we're now making sure that the tenant doesn't, well, we better charge for the tenants. We're minimizing the risk of the tenant moving on. And that helps with occupancy, because one of the risks that we have in this market is that if your property is going to be empty, your chance of having a vacant unit is much higher than it was 18 months ago. And so what you want to do is minimize the risk, which is make your tenant happier, which means that the tenant is a better chance of staying, which then mitigates that risk that you're potentially going to have. So those are your two main areas, is your collections and your occupancy. Those are your two main areas to maximize your cash flow.
I'm in conversation this evening with David Beattie, who's an entrepreneur, but also the author of The Expert Landlord. And we're looking at how landlords can best prepare for the 2021 property year. We are taking your questions and comments at home, especially if you're a landlord and still wondering how you can sort of best weather the current economic storm that you're finding yourselves in. And we will be getting to some of the questions and comments shortly. I mean, David, I think you've done such a great job of highlighting some of the things that we should be doing or putting in place that will put us in a great place in terms of managing our portfolios and making sure that as landlords you're sort of best equipped to handle not just, I suppose, COVID times, but even outside of a pandemic, right? But I want us to look at what the landlords who are struggling right now, what are some of the things that they didn't do right? Because I think one of the things with a topic like this is that you also want landlords to get a sense of what they shouldn't do. And I'm sure some of them will pick up as you take us through it. They'll probably pick up one or two things that they do actually do. And it's almost a red flagging your own behavior and this needs to change because you're potentially, driving into dangerous territory. So what are some of the things that landlords who are currently struggling, what did they essentially do wrong that has almost gotten them to where their portfolios are performing poorly? I mean, even perhaps below where some of the other, portfolios are performing. We know we're performing slightly lower than pre-COVID numbers, but I think some are doing far worse than other landlords.
Yeah, I think, there's a whole bunch of things. One of them is not maintaining a property. And look, I get it. Most, if not all landlords have cash flow challenges, but being difficult on maintenance is a big challenge. Rather be proactive on doing quality maintenance, because in the long term that's going to help with your occupancy levels, and it's going to help with your tenant happiness and performance. Another thing is landlords that are being too reactive. In this kind of market, you need to kind of make decisions quite quickly and assess the situation and make a decision quickly. And if we can't get hold of a landlord, if they're not accessible, then those decisions take much longer. Or if landlords don't make decisions or don't help us in making decisions, then you're going to find that definitely affects performance. You've got some landlords that I think you need to kind of understand the nuance of where we're at. So for the first 3 months or 4 months of last year after lockdown started, there was a lot of Ubuntu and a lot of landlords were very kind of working with tenants to give rent discounts and so forth. And I think that was completely in order. And those business-minded landlords definitely caught that very well. But unfortunately, say 4 to 6 months into the pandemic, landlords just actually couldn't afford it anymore, number one. And number two, certain tenants were taking advantage of it. Then you had to change your subtlety, your approach had to become a little bit more business-like or hardcore, can I say it? And so that adjustment to understanding where the market was, and then also to being partners with us as rental agents is really important. So I was saying to landlords, you now need to actually turn the screws on tenants, because no one can afford you to get zero rent anymore, or even have a 50% discount. So I think understanding the nuance of the market. And then the last thing I would say is become partners with your rental suppliers or your maintenance supplier or your rental agent. The margins for all of us as rental agents, as maintenance suppliers, and as landlords, the margins and the amount of money we're making is so low at the moment that I simply cannot afford to work with a landlord that's not going to be willing to work as a partner with me. And there's been plenty of landlords over the last 6 months who I've fired because I can no longer afford to do it. And it's the same with maintenance suppliers and those kind of things. Work together with your provider. I'm not saying necessarily paying premium prices or anything, but work together. In this market, you've got to work. I say we're all working together against this monster, which is the market. And we can kill this monster if we all work together as partners. But if we're not going to work together as partners and having that partnership approach, this monster ain't going to be killed. And I would just say that's super important.
I mean, don't let the economists hear you. Anytime we kind of talk about the market, I think all kinds of different kinds of economists tend to emerge, and they always obviously have their own take on the monster that is, the economy and what we can or cannot do to control or not control it. We are, of course, at home taking your questions and comments as we look at what landlords can do to prepare for the 2021 year in property. And we've got a very, and you're used to these questions, David, this one's coming from Utsapo Mukhubudu on Facebook asking, so what happens if a tenant damages your property beyond the deposit amount he or she has paid?
Yeah, look, it depends how much. I would suggest your biggest thing with a defaulting tenant or a tenant that's been a naughty person is to get occupation of your property again. That is your first goal. The second goal is to then claim for any extra damages that is over and above the deposit. But please understand, in most respects, if not most, professional landlords know that once a tenant is left, any chance of claiming on those damages is nigh on impossible. So, but nevertheless, your first thing is to get your keys back on that property and you get your occupancy back. Basically, the answer to the question is, if you can claim through a small claims court or through a judgment or something like that, then one should try that. But I would suggest, if it's 1,000 Rand, 2,000 Rand, I would suggest you don't want to throw good money after bad. I mean, if you're talking about 20, 30,000 Rand of extra funds, well, then maybe it's worth throwing the die and getting a lawyer to then go forward with that kind of person. But typically, a person that damages the property a little and is not maybe paying all their rent can't afford any extra funds anyway. But this is where it also comes to, with experience, focus on the main goal and don't be distracted by things which aren't necessarily as realistic to achieve or not necessarily actually your main goal. So that question, I'm sorry, I'm not maybe answering as clearly as I could, but the question is actually, what I would say is, how do I get occupation of my property? My main question wouldn't be, how do I get the funds? I'm not saying it's not an important question, but it's not the main question.
Okay. David, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I wanted to explore is one of the things with 2021 and even a huge chunk of last year, a lot of people were citing the historically low interest rates and how this is a buyer's market and a great time to get into property. And we've certainly seen a high number of first-time home buyers, and there's an increasing interest of people who want to venture into rental properties and sort of add a few more properties to their property portfolio. when we then look at people who are, I've called them potential new investors. So they've already bought that first property. They're now looking at, their first rental or perhaps a second rental. How should they be looking at, we'll say, the 2021 year in property, as they now going to not just be obviously a homeowner, but are also going to be a landlord?
It comes down to, once again, working on the fundamentals and the basics. Do the numbers work? The only nuance I can add to that, as opposed to thinking that there might be an upside to this property investment, only make your decision, your forward or yes decision on purchasing an investment if the numbers work with no upside. That would be my comment.
Mm-hmm. And I actually like that comment because
I'm not expecting the market to improve much in the coming while, and that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. If your investment is reliant on the market improving, I would suggest rather be conservative and don't go for it.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things, David, and I was saying this to you even off air, that is, in as much as, I'm pro generally buying, but obviously you want to make an informed decision. You want to best understand before you kind of blindly buy that investment property. And we're seeing quite a lot of, new entrants, especially millennials who want to venture into rental property, and they're still not quite sure of how to think through it. And oftentimes they may, run their numbers and say, okay, I'll be able to afford the bond installment. Some may make the mistake of not adding all the other associated costs. Some perhaps actually did go a step further because they've been watching the show religiously, so they know to add all these other costs, but then they go and almost overestimate what they could potentially get on rental, especially in a market where we're seeing that we're not seeing, double-digit rental escalation. Sometimes we're not seeing rental escalation. So almost need to be very prudent in the numbers that you're also running, especially when it comes to how much you think you'll be able to collect. We've seen certain landlords, lowering their price just slightly so they can retain their good tenants during this period. And some of them actually were able to do so because they've got that buffer in their portfolio. And so I think to new entrants, that's also just such an important exercise, as you're saying, to not count on the upside. Because I think a lot of us, when we kind of start out, they're like, the market is here, but I think in the next 2-3 months, it may potentially change. And that's when I'll start making my buck.
No, we get zero increases. As a standard, zero rent increases. So if you normally, and the property coaches and organizations might say, okay, you get your 5% vacancy, put it at 10 or 15%. If the agent is saying you're going to get 7,500 Rand for this rent, put your figure in as 6,500. The other day I was marketing something in Pausoff. There were 72 other units being rented at the same price. So my landlord's an incredibly experienced landlord. He hit it out the park. We went in at kind of the lowest price. Look, there wasn't a very high price band. Went to the lowest price. I got it rented out. And because he's wise, he's experienced, he had the margin and he could do it. But if you really couldn't, the numbers only work at 8,000 Rand, it ain't going to happen.
Mm-hmm. More of your questions and comments at home. I see one of our top fan gang members, Usemi Mashasa, saying, hopefully COVID-19 doesn't spoil things, but up to so far, rentals are improving, especially private student accommodation. I'm glad to actually hear that, because I know that a lot of landlords who are in student accommodation, saw a decrease in their numbers, especially last year with some of their tenants moving out before time. Some of them are saying they're kind of struggling to get tenants this year because some of them are opting to stay at home and rather just have, fast internet at home and not actually stay at res or at private accommodation. But David, before then I let you go, any final tips for our landlords this year as they navigate their property portfolios and, of course, better manage their relationship with their tenants?
I just think I think there's so much potential for wise landlords and for perceptive landlords that are willing to learn and get us advice. The resource what you're giving, for example, in your podcasts, the property coaches that are out there, the books and so forth. I really think that the market is terrible. It's really, really, and city and the government, the way they're treating us and the way that, the way we work within the municipalities, it's really difficult. But in the midst of all that, I do believe those that are conservative and those that are bold really can make a really good success in this market. And I encourage them to go for it. We need property entrepreneurs in our country to be bold and but wise and to go for it.
And that's a great place to leave it at. David, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Pleasure. Great to see you again.
And that is David Beattie, who is a property entrepreneur and also author of The Expert Landlord. Well, that's it from us this evening on a Tuesday evening here on the Private Property Podcast with myself, Zamantungo Kumalo. I do not leave you alone. It's a Tuesday, so later on, Mbali Nogo will be bringing you the Tuesday edition of the Farming Podcast. Until then, hope you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Khumutsopoe, and I'm an entrepreneur from Soweto. Soweto's come a long way, from a small township to a mini city of its own. Soweto's got some really nice suburbs, like Diepkloof Extension, but the locals call it Diepkloof Expensive. Orlando is known as the suburb that had the first brick houses built in Soweto. Orlando Stadium for its iconic games between Kaizer Chiefs and Pirates. And most importantly, Vilakazi Street, where Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu resided. To the west of Soweto, you find suburbs of Dobsonville and Protea. These two suburbs are actually very cosmopolitan, fresh, young, and very new. Right next door to Soweto, we have our neighboring suburb, which is Eldorado Park. For a little adventure and a little fun, Soweto's got so many night spots, from the News Cafe at Mponya Mall, to your Vilakazi Streets at Kumzi's, to just chilling at Chafpozi just between the towers and having a simple braai vleis chisanyama. Something very close to my heart is actually seeing people move back into Soweto, growing businesses, remodeling homes. It merely says to us that Soweto is a growing city. There's way more to this place than what we think. Soweto needs to be discovered daily. I'm so proud to call Soweto my home, and this is my neighborhood.